Good morning.
There we go. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Sachin Chheda. I'm director of the Wisconsin Fair Elections Project and chair of the Wisconsin Fair Maps Coalition. I really appreciate the opportunity to come not only to testify as to the merits of SB 621 and its companion legislation for the legislative and congressional maps, but also to address some of the things that we heard in the testimony from the two leaders this morning. I want to start just very quickly with a story about my kids. I have 4 children, 4 boys, ages 7, I had to think about that for a second, from 7 to 20. And the youngest, his 3 older brothers are quite a bit older. And so he's almost like an only child because he's 12 years younger than the oldest child. And we have 2 neighbors, and there are 5 boys in those 3 houses. All of whom are older than him, but some just a couple of years older. And until he was about 5 or so, they didn't really want to hang out with him. But when he turned 5, they're like, hey, we're gonna bring these kids into our games, right? And these 6 boys are all very into sports. They play baseball and soccer and basketball. And so you see them out front in the front yards of the 3 houses. And you see them alongside, other kids will come from around the neighborhood. We have a ton of kids in the neighborhood. And they'll have to make up teams. They'll have to decide for themselves how to set up the teams for kickball or football or a little game of wiffle ball. And they do a really amazing job of splitting up their kids, right? The 15-year-old and the 14-year-old and the 12-year-old don't play against the 7 and the 9 and the 10-year-old because that would be deeply unfair, right? We would know the outcome of those games, right? Sometimes the 7 and 9-year-old play with the 15-year-old. Sometimes it's more split up than that. Sometimes more kids get in, but they do a pretty good job. That's not to say they don't argue and fight all the time, just like legislators. Hopefully they'll be a little less dismissive and rude than what I heard earlier this morning. But because I think acting respectfully is incredibly important. And we teach that to our children. We teach them the example of even when you disagree and even when there's conflict to be able to resolve things. But they sort themselves into these fair battles. That, I think, is an allegory for what Wisconsin has had up until 2012 for over 100 years. A system in which the people spoke up and they were heard. I'm not texting here. I'm looking at my notes. And they were heard by the folks who were elected to office, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. We had a bipartisan history of getting things done. And I want to read from the Constitution because I heard a couple of people say that this thing is not in the Constitution. But let me just say what is in the Constitution, and I'll read from the Declaration of Rights. This is the 2nd paragraph of the Wisconsin Constitution. It's very short. All people are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Their just powers from the consent of the governed are not just empty words. They are meaningful, and they are meaningful in the redistricting process. So when we ask Ledge Council or politicians to say, is there a requirement that our elections are fair and result in legislatures that are reflective of the will of the people, I would argue there is a constitutional requirement, and I bet I'd win that argument. You're welcome to take me to court on that, but I think the consent of the governed means something. I want to say a few facts. One fact is this. It is true, and I will concede, that the U.S. Supreme Court, in what is seen as a highly partisan decision after one justice who originally heard the cases in Whitford and Rucho left and was replaced by another justice, they did say that partisan gerrymandering was not justiciable by the federal courts. They did not, as was alleged very clearly and falsely this morning, rule on the merits. They did not rule on the merits. They said it wasn't justiciable. Now, some of you are lawyers and some of you aren't, but that distinction is incredibly important because there is only one time that the merits were discussed for Act 43. And Act 43 matters because Act 43 is this. SB 621 and Act 43 are essentially the same, right? We're talking about continuousness or whatever the terms that are being used. And that court was a 3-judge panel in the Western District of Wisconsin with two judges appointed by Republicans. And that panel said that this map, the Act 43 map, now continued in SB 621, violated the constitutional rights of Wisconsin citizens because it made it essentially impossible for Democrats to win a majority. And it went further than that. It said that the Republican Party had the intent to draw themselves a permanent lasting majority, and it said that they succeeded in drawing themselves a lasting permanent majority. And in that case, testimony was taken, and that testimony was cross-examined from Democratic experts and Republican experts, from Republican staff who drew the maps, and from folks from all over the state who were plaintiffs who said, we've been affected by these maps. And that testimony and those cross-examinations have since gone unrefuted. Nothing that was said in that court case that is on the record in a federal case is wrong. Nobody ever said it was wrong. And what was proven in that case, is that the maps are rigged. Now, let me also say something else that was proven. And this was math. In addition to what Professor Ellenberg said in his written testimony that's been submitted to you, there was analysis done on the geographic distribution of voters in Wisconsin. And I will concede, and you all can listen very closely, I will concede Republicans have a slight advantage in the geographic distribution in Wisconsin. It's true. There's a natural gerrymander in favor of Republicans. That advantage is about 2%. So when you have an efficiency gap in a map that's been proposed in SB 621 of 10 to 16%, you have 5 to 8 times the bias in favor of Republicans in the map. These are facts. I'd be happy to answer questions about these facts. Let me also just state again for the record, I think it's been stated, so I'll try not to belabor the point, that yes, people live everywhere. Republicans live everywhere and Democrats live everywhere. And there's a whole lot of Democrats in Madison and Milwaukee, and there's a whole lot of Republicans in Waukesha County and Washington County and some other counties around the state. But the third most number of Democrats in the state are in Waukesha County. There are more Democrats in Waukesha County than any other county in the state than there are in, There are more Democrats in Waukesha County than any other county in the state except for Dane and Milwaukee counties. Now, that doesn't mean I think that Democrats should win assembly seats in Waukesha County the way that people are distributed. That would be ridiculous. Maybe eventually in the city of Waukesha as that gets more diverse. But right now, that would be ridiculous. And I agree with something that I heard Speaker Voss say, which is to say, look, you got 52 or 53 or 54% of the vote in a particular election. And when the Republicans get 54% of the vote, they should get 60 or 62 or 64% of the seats. We don't have proportional representation. We don't have a parliamentary system. We have a first-past-the-post single-member district system in Wisconsin. And so that means that little wins will be magnified across the state of Wisconsin. But what we saw in the last 10 years is across the state, statewide, in 2 out of the last 5 elections, Democrats won massive majorities of the vote in 2012 and in 2018. Massive majorities. And the number of seats allocated to those Democrats didn't change at all in the legislature, or changed by 1 seat. Now, your argument, the argument made earlier by the person giving the testimony is that was the candidates and the campaigns. So the question I'd ask that no one's ever been able to answer, and I would love to be in a dialogue with one of the members of the majority party on this, is in 2006, the Democrats took the Senate. And in 2008, the Democrats took the Assembly and controlled both houses. And in 2010, under fair maps drawn by a court in 2001 and 2002, the Republicans took the majority. That absolutely happened. And then in 2012, the Democrats won even more of the vote than they had won in 2006. And they didn't gain a single seat in the Assembly, and they lost the majority in the Senate. We forget that the Democrats won the majority in the Senate in the summer of 2012. That didn't reflect bad candidates. That didn't reflect the will of the voters. It's simply a lie. It's not true, because not enough Democrats moved from one place to another in the state of Wisconsin between 2008 and 2012 to justify the massive redistribution of votes in the vote seat allocation. The only explanation is a lack of partisan symmetry, partisan bias, and the change in the efficiency gap of the map. That's the only explanation. And that's what a federal court said, and that's gone unrefuted. That's what every expert who testifies today will tell you, those are the facts. Now, let me also point out, continuity is not only not required, it's wrong. It's wrong. It's immoral. It's anti-democratic, and it's anti-American. And let me tell you why. Because we should never consider the interests of incumbent politicians when we are drawing a map. And when the Democratic members of the Milwaukee County Board did so in the last few weeks, I stood up as the former chair of the Democratic Party of Milwaukee County and said that was wrong over and over again. I'm on the record. I'm on the record saying what Democrats have done in Illinois is wrong. I'm on the record saying that Democrats gerrymandering in New York is wrong. So this idea that there's hypocrisy from the Movement for Fair Maps is false. The New Jersey Democrats tried to gerrymander the maps 2 years ago, mid-decade, and the movement nationally stood up and said, don't do that. Don't do it. And we're saying don't do it here. Not because I think Democrats should be in charge or Democrats should even win the majority in every election, but because when Democrats do win significant majorities, they should be in the majority. Partisan symmetry requires that. So we've talked about packing, and we recognize there's a little bit of a natural gerrymander. It's not anything close to the claims of the majority party. We've talked about incumbent protection, which is simply wrong. Let's talk about the character of Wisconsin. Let's talk about who we are as a people. And let's talk about what the people of Wisconsin want. Because right now we have a system in which when huge majorities of Wisconsin say they want something, the majority party in the legislature chooses not even to debate it. They gavel the session in and they gavel the session out. We won't even have a hearing. In fact, the chairman here has refused to have a hearing on a bill that even Republican members have sponsored and asked him for a hearing for. You've said no hearing on that bill, even though 72% of the public has said that they want to pass that bill. So we're not talking about what you pass. I don't expect Republican legislators to vote against their own values and their own interests, but we don't even have the conversation anymore. And I'll tell you, I've been doing politics in Wisconsin for 30 years. This is not the state that Tommy Thompson led. This is not the state that Patrick Lucy led or Gaylord Nelson led. This isn't even the state Scott McCallum led. This is a different character to our politics. And I will tell you, as a parent, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to see how people treat one another. It's embarrassing how many times the speaker interrupted his colleagues with comments. It's embarrassing. Let's talk to each other with some civility. And I heard that from a lot of members up here, but I didn't hear it reciprocated from the leadership. Now, I think even Republican citizens are affected, not just Democratic citizens. Republican citizens are affected by gerrymandering. There is no doubt there is gerrymandering. You can argue from here until Sunday, but there's no argument that this map is gerrymandered and that partisan considerations played the greatest role, not continuousness, not incumbent protection, not equal population, and I'm going to go into that as I conclude my remarks in just a couple of moments. But let me tell you how Republican citizens are affected, because sometimes the special interests aren't partisan. Sometimes the special interests aren't about the left side and the right side. They're about different business interests competing with each other. They're about Main Street versus big boxes. They're about what type of policy we're going to have in our schools. It's about, because there's no disagreement that people want their schools funded in Wisconsin. There's no disagreement that we want a world-class university system. Go ask your constituents, even in a gerrymandered district. They want their schools funded. They want their roads fixed, right? So what happens in a system in which special interests dominate because the parties are in control, not the citizens, is that when you're a Main Street business, if the speaker doesn't already agree with you, if the party's not already on your side, you can't get heard. And if you're a Democrat, like I am, living in a hardcore Democratic district, my state representative is 1 block from me. If he disagrees with me, there's nothing I can do. I can't convince him to listen, right? Not because he's not a good guy, but because there's no reason. He's going to get reelected no matter what. So let's talk a little here at the end just about the math. I know that these maps are rigged for 3 reasons. Well, actually, there's probably 40 reasons, but let me talk about 3. One is the computer simulation. Let's just be clear. People were arguing about whether the testimony had been submitted. I'm testifying. Let me submit the testimony. They drew at the Princeton University, they drew 1 million maps using a computer model. 1 million different maps, all that had to comply with VRA requirements, contiguousness, population deviation, compactness, all of the rules that are the traditional criteria. 30 of those produced a majority for Republicans similar to SB 621. 30 of a million. Now, that's just one data point. Let's talk about two other data points that I'll put together. One is the plan score. This is an efficiency gap measure. 10 to 16%. Again, this statistic has gone unrefuted. It's one of many measures of partisan bias and anti-symmetry. 10 to 16% efficiency gap deviation is 5 to 8 times the natural gerrymander proven in court for the Republican majority. And let me add to that. I've got a third one here that I'm trying to dig out of my brain. I'll come back to it in a moment. The last thing I'll say about that is let's look at the districts. You know, in 2018, there were 6 competitive Senate districts. One of them was held by the senator from the 5th. And he won. I'm not going to say he didn't win. He won. It had been gerrymandered so he could win, but it came close because things are changing in Wauwatosa. That's the reason. Things are changing in Wauwatosa and Eastern Brookfield. And he won by, I think it was a point and a half. If you look at the expected vote for Republican in the 5th district, it's not about the candidate. We had a good candidate. She lost by a point and a half. If you look at the expected vote under SB 621, he's going to win by 30 points. That's not about the communities of interest. That's about saving the senator for the 5th. Talk about the representative for the 24th, who's on this member of this committee. He won by 5 points, 6 points. Look at the expected map under SB 621. He's going to win by more than 20. Yeah, that's right. The Dems get a much stronger 23rd, which they've already won. The Dems get a much stronger 14th, which they've already won. And you just take it from other places. So that's gerrymandering. Now, I want to say one last thing. People have talked a lot here about scoring political points. I couldn't believe what I heard. And I think even members of the Speaker's party should be offended. Out here talking about political points. When we heard the dishonest testimony we heard this morning, the fact is that you can't submit plans all the way up until Friday the 15th at whatever, 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and then introduce language to be drawn into a bill on Monday morning. They didn't just draw a bill that weekend. Come on. And the reason I know this is because Joe Handrick, former legislator, consultant, submitted a whole bunch of maps to that Draw Your District portal. And for the record, we told everybody, submit maps to the portal. We think it's great that you're going through this exercise. I don't think you listen to it, because if you look at the maps that even Republicans submitted to that portal, the advantage adhered to Republicans is much less. Just like in 2011 and 2012, what the Republicans have done is they've seen a whole bunch of maps drawn, and then they've taken the one at the very edge, the one that's the most partisan. And under the cloak of saying that it's legal and it's constitutional, let's be clear. All that was decided in the Whitford and Rucho cases is that the U.S. Supreme Court said that it was not justiciable by federal courts. It's still justiciable in state courts. It just hasn't been litigated. It's going to be litigated, I think, over the next 6 months. And I think we're going to see a decision about whether or not, in a state where we have the consent of the governed as our core principle, whether or not completely unfair maps will be allowed. Now, I love Senator Tammy Baldwin. I used to work for Senator Tammy Baldwin. I did her campaign in 2000. I think she's a wonderful leader, and I think she is the kind of person who can garner the support of the vast majority of Wisconsinites, just like Tommy Thompson did, and just like Herb Kohl did, and just like so many politicians in Wisconsin history have, to get to 60 or 65% of the population. But the idea that one politician being able to do that should be an indication that any politician should be able to do that actually doesn't prove what the previous testifiers think it does. It proves the opposite. Because what we know is that the majority party right now in district after district after district after district can run almost anybody. You could be incredibly smart, you could be strong, you could be connected to your community, you could be a good leader, you could be someone who listens, or you could be a total clown. It doesn't matter. In almost every case in those gerrymandered districts, the Republican's going to win. And your argument is, well, if we run Jesus himself in every assembly district, then the Democrats will be able to win a majority. Again, this is about character. I would never teach my kids to play a game that way. And when they go outside and they say, we're going to play kickball, or we're going to throw a football around, or we're going to play 500, they try to make me throw even though I can't really throw overhand because of my shoulder right now. the expectation is I'm going to be fair. And if I throw the ball and every time I just throw it to my own kid so he can score those points in 500, that wouldn't be right. What you're doing isn't right. It's immoral. It's unethical. It's anti-American. And the people don't stand for it. And the only way that you're going to get this through isn't because the people support it. It's because you leveraged power in 2011 when you had the trifecta. You slammed through maps that are deeply unfair. And the last word I'm going to use is it's cowardly. Because I think you can gain the majority, Republicans, of the people of Wisconsin. Tommy Thompson did, and you did in 2010, and Scott Walker did. I think you can earn the support fairly of the people of Wisconsin, and you'll do it probably even more than 50% of the time. But you won't do it every time. And you didn't do it every time in the last 10 years. And if you tell yourself you did, you're lying to yourself. And that's why there's so many people here saying enough is enough, and we must reject SB 621 and move to a map that reflects the competitive nature and the will of the voters in Wisconsin. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. A couple questions for you.
Yes, sir.
You indicated you think Republicans do have a slight advantage of some type in this state?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Your number one of your three things that you had mentioned kind of towards your conclusion, you were talking about that Princeton study, I believe?
It was an analysis done, I think, last week or the week before by Princeton of SB 621 and comparing it to their computer-generated maps.
And what was the stats on that? 30 maps favored Republicans out of a million?
So there were 1 million maps drawn,
Yeah.
and then they were measured for their competitiveness. And of those 1 million maps, 30 of them reached the level of partisan bias exhibited in SB 621. So a very tiny percentage. In other words, you have to be at the very edge of all the different. So you can draw literally an infinite number of maps, or close to an infinite number of maps, that comply with the traditional redistricting criteria and are legal and constitutional. And even in the Draw Your District portal, there are dozens that have been submitted that I think even the Speaker would admit comply with those requirements. In fact, former Representative Handrick submitted, the first map he submitted, which we analyzed fully, had about a 55-45 Republican split. The SB 621 is somewhere between 61 and 66 assembly seats, and then the comparative number of Democratic seats. And so what the Princeton study said is that if you just took 1 million maps and then you put them in a line that said, how fair are they, right? SB 621 is all the way at the farthest edge, the very, 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 very edge, just as Act 43 was in all, and I don't remember his name, but Professor Choi did that analysis, and it was introduced as evidence in the Whitford case. That was also the case for Act 43, that not only are these maps that are being drawn and introduced and passed by Republicans in Wisconsin in this decade and last decade, not only are they compliant, according to the standards you're talking about, but they're also specifically designed to be the most partisan. And there's no reason for that other than to extend the power of Republicans even in the face of Democratic wave elections. So what I'm suggesting is that you could pass a fair map or a fairer map. I'm not suggesting a 50-50 map, a fairer map that would give Democrats a fighting chance if the people of Wisconsin actually supported them and decided to reject the point of view Republicans put forward. Instead, what the Republicans do is they say it doesn't matter what the people think, right? We're just going to make sure that we're going to have a majority no matter what, and then we can claim the support of the people because the elections led that way, but it's rooted in the maps being drawn that way, not in some fair fight and not in the sense of actually trying to discern the will of the people.
Thanks. If you could keep an answer maybe a little more tailored to the question would be great. But I got to tell you this.
I'm sorry, did you ask Speaker Voss to do that?
I got to tell you this, that the people who created these maps, they must have just been geniuses, because without the aid of a computer and all the elites in Princeton, man, I don't know how they could have come up with a map as you characterize it. I mean, that to me is just shocking how that could have occurred.
I'd be happy to respond to that because we know what. So again, this map, everyone's admitted, there's no disagreement. This map is rooted in Act 43 and its least changes from Act 43. I think we can all agree on that. So there was a ton of federal testimony under oath in federal court about how Act 43 was drawn. Adam Foltz and Ted Othman got on the stand, or at least one of them did. I don't remember which one of the two. And Keith Gaddy got on the stand. I don't know if you guys remember that name. He's a University of Oklahoma professor that taxpayers paid a ton of money to help draw the maps in the secret map room in the law firm across the street. And what Keith said was, yeah, we used computers and we drew map after map after map and we kept testing. And they were doing this over the course of, remember, months, not a weekend. It was over the course of months. And what they did is they said, okay, here's a map. And again, this is what the testimony showed. Let's start with 52 seats. If we start with the 2002 map that was drawn by the court, the Republicans have a baseline of 52 out of 99 assembly seats. And then let's draw a map that gets to 55 assembly seats. Let's 56, 57, 58. They got up to 59 assembly seats, and then they kept it at 59 assembly seats, but they kept tweaking the districts so that the wave, the Democratic wave that map could withstand was even greater than any wave that the Democrats had ever won in Wisconsin history. So basically what they were saying is for the Democrats to win a majority, they would have to win more votes statewide than any Democratic candidate had ever won in the history of Wisconsin. I mean, that's like Herb Kohl. That's like, I don't know which president won, which Democratic presidential candidate won the most. And so I think that tells you that, and just to be clear, even under Tammy Baldwin's election in 2012, right, in 2012, not 2018, in 2012, the Republicans win a majority. So I think that what we're saying is that, yeah, I agree with you, Chairman Strobel. That's exactly right, that it takes a ton of work. There's a whole lot of intention that has to go into that. And that's what we proved in court. We proved it in court, right? That's what two Republican judges said. They said, yeah, you tried to rig it. You did rig it. It was effective. It worked. And they said it should be unconstitutional. And then the Supreme Court majority said, no, the federal court shouldn't decide whether or not it's unconstitutional.
Yep, and we're talking about new maps that are based upon new census data, and there were significant changes. So
Mr. Chairman, if I can,
you can't. No, I'm not done. Okay, one moment, please. Okay, and for a computer analysis to come out of 1 million with 30 iterations going the other way, I think you got to maybe be questioning the inputs on that when you yourself indicate that Wisconsin is slightly tilted towards Republicans. So I guess I'll finish just with this question. So do you believe that there is such a thing as a nonpartisan commission and that a nonpartisan commission can create nonpartisan maps? Do you believe that?
I do, although I think in practice what that means is a bipartisan commission. And so if you look at the various commission models that are all over the country, the idea isn't to necessarily identify a unicorn, which is I think what you guys are trying to argue and say that should be what it's about. It's to say let's have a process that's inclusive. And an inclusive process includes Democrats, it includes Republicans, it includes people who view themselves as independent, and it results in something that can gain broad support. What I would argue is that if we were a state that was committed to inclusiveness and committed to participation, you would say, hey, let's have a map that has to be passed by 2/3 of the legislature. That would be a process. And in fact, if you look at the bill that's been put forward, it says in order to override the commission, that's exactly what it says. It's either 2/3 or 3/4, I can't remember, of the legislature would have to override the commission. And so the point of that is to say, let's take redistricting as not like every other bill. It's not like a debate about taxes or education policy and whether or not we should ban talking about racism or, it's not like any of those other things. It's about creating the model under which you actually implement democracy in a republic, right, which is what we have in America. And it should be different. It should be slightly different. And so I would suggest that it is a good idea to take it out of your hands because even, what I'll tell you is, I think I'm going to say something you agree with, Chairman Strobel. I've heard from Democrats who honestly, in their hearts, are like, you know what, the good thing about the Republican map is that their district is safe. I've heard that, right? Because politicians inherently want to protect themselves. They want to stay in their job. And that's wrong. It's just simply wrong. And I think the people of Wisconsin think it's wrong. And that's why you see such massive outcry. And you have seen such massive outcry over these bills, over gerrymandering for the last 10 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chheda. I really appreciate your passion for the state of Wisconsin and your children, which is what I'm here for too. Children, the future, the next decades after that. I But I have a really direct question that I think is going to help the chairman understand your point, and that is, was there only 30 maps that favored Republicans out of that million?
No. There were 30 maps that were favored Republicans as badly as SB 21. More than half the maps had at least a slight bias, if not a greater bias. And so there was a continuum. At one edge, there were maps that favored Democrats moderately. At one edge, there were maps that favored Republicans much more substantially. The median map would favor Republicans somewhere between 2 and 3 points statewide, and that would be a fair map in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today to testify before these two committees. I think that sort of at least there's three things that we all agree on today. One is that this bill is sort of the least changes from Act 43. Two is that Tammy Baldwin is great. And the third one is that I don't know everything. So I'm not sure if I missed it when I was in the back. Can you explain the efficiency gap?
Yeah, and I did not explain it, so you didn't miss it. You didn't
All
miss
right.
it. So efficiency gap is a tool used by academics and social scientists to measure the amount of partisan bias and the amount of partisan symmetry in a particular map. And it's not the only tool. There are many tools that one can use. I'm not an expert on all of them, but I'm sure there'll be someone else speaking later today who will be able to speak to that in more detail. And to be clear, in Act 43, those measures were all consistent. In other words, efficiency gap and other measures of partisan bias all said the same thing, which was that there was a substantial gerrymander in Act 43, and the initial analysis of SB 621 says that continues that, because as you've noted, and as we heard for the last 2 hours, we're not talking about a new map. We're talking about a map that has changed the least possible from Act 43, right? And I think that was the number one statement that we heard from the two leaders here at this table. What the efficiency gap is it's a measure of wasted votes, and so it's a tool. You take the number of votes you need to win, and those count, and then you take the number of votes over the number that you needed to win for the winner, and then you take all the votes for the loser because they didn't work, they were evasive, and you kind of measure on each side, Republicans and Democrats, how many votes were wasted. And in a 50-50 state, now again, this is different in a state that's not a 50-50 state, but in a 50-50 state with a 50-50 election, right, you'd expect to see a 0% efficiency gap. Now, if the persuasive nature of Republicans in a particular year is greater and they win a much greater percentage than 50% of the vote, then that's going to affect the measure. But basically, it's used as a tool to see in isolation what does that look like. And it measures what the additional benefit is to one part or the other over a 50-50 election. So it's important to say that I don't think, again, I said this earlier, that I don't think Democrats should get 50% of the seats and Republicans should get 50% of the seats. I think we should have campaigns and elections and candidates in single-member districts. And if one party gets 52 or 53 or 54% of the statewide vote, that's usually going to result in like 60% of the seats because they're going to win a whole bunch of races closely, right? What happens in the measure of partisan symmetry that the efficiency gap tells us in Wisconsin is that when Republicans win 53 or 54% of the vote, they get like 65% of the seats. And when they get 47% of the vote, they get 60% of the seats. And when they get 45% of the vote, they get like 52% of the seats. And until you get Republicans down to like 42 or 43% of the vote, they don't lose the majority. And so it's incredibly asymmetrical. And the argument has been that it's asymmetrical because all the Democrats live in Madison and Milwaukee. Like, I hear that argument. That's the rhetoric. It's very easy to say because when you look at a map, you see those two deep blue hues. But the fact is that the bias statewide is only about 2 or 3%. And so what I would say is, in a 50-50 election, Republicans should get 52, 53, 54% of the seats, right? And if it's a wave election for Democrats, they should win a majority, as they did in 2008 in both houses and as they did in 2006 and 2012 in the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. Pretty incredible testimony. I was wondering if you could fill us in on what the federal courts ruled when they ruled that the maps drawn in 2011 were unconstitutional. What were some of the basis to that?
Yeah, and I apologize. I don't have the language of the ruling in front of me, and so I wish I could quote from it, and I apologize that I don't have that. So there was a 3-judge panel in the Western District. Those judges were a judge from the Western District, a judge from the Eastern District, and then a judge from Indiana on the 7th Circuit. And it was appointed by the Chief Judge of the 7th Circuit. And they had a trial in the Madison, in the Kastenmeier building, and they heard testimony from experts. They heard testimony from citizens. They heard testimony from the people who drew the maps, both consultants and staff from the legislature. And they issued a ruling in, I think it was November of 2016, that, and I'm paraphrasing, I apologize, I don't have the language of the ruling in front of me, that the maps were unconstitutional because they disenfranchised too many Wisconsin citizens, and they specifically disenfranchised Democrats over Republicans in Wisconsin, and that wasn't constitutional because we require some basic level of fairness. We require the consent of the governed, right? That was their view, and they used a test, a 3-part test that was rooted in the test for racial gerrymandering, which is long-established law, and they applied a very similar test to partisan gerrymandering. So you had to prove intent, you had to prove effect, and then you had to prove that there was no other way to do it, right? You had to show that there was no alternative, or you had to show that there was no alternative in order to keep the maps, right? So we were able to show intent, we were able to show the effect, and then we were able to show that there were alternatives, in fact, that they could have used. What the U.S. Supreme Court eventually did, both in Whitford and Rucha then, is to say that may be true or may not be true in terms of the actual facts, but federal courts aren't going to decide claims of partisan gerrymandering, and they should be decided in state law and by state courts or by state legislatures. And so subsequent to that, the North Carolina Supreme Court and the Pennsylvania Supreme Court took cases and said that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional under state constitutional law. Quite a few states have passed nonpartisan commissions to try to say, okay, well, now you won't have intent, right? Because if you have a biased map, but it was drawn by a nonpartisan body or by a court, then there's no intent. So you can't call that a partisan gerrymander, even if there's bias shown. And in Wisconsin, we just haven't had that case. Like that hasn't been litigated. It was litigated in federal court, has not yet been litigated in state court, and we expect that will happen.
Representative Sinicki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Sachin, for all the work you've done on this. First of all, I just want to say I can't believe that little baby boy that I fell in love with is 7 years old already. My gosh, where'd that time go? Could you just, he's got the most beautiful eyes, just so y'all know. Could you just tell us a little bit about your organization? And I'm kind of curious to know how big the organization is,
Sure,
I know
I'd be
it's
happy to.
nonpartisan, and just kind of describe some
I'd
of the
be
work
happy
you've
to.
done.
And again, I like to concede things to my Republican friends, and so I'll do that as well. Let me just say he has my eyes, and that's why they're so beautiful. I can't even get a laugh from that side of the aisle, even for something as innocuous as that. It's unbelievable what's happened to our state. So I'm a Democrat. Let's be very clear. I was chair of the Democratic Party in Milwaukee County when I got involved with this work. Our organization is nonpartisan. Our honorary co-chairs are former Senate Majority Leaders Tim Cullen and former Senate Majority Leader Dale Schultz. The Fair Elections Project was formed as an outreach organization. It's a 501c3 it's a project under the High Ground Institute. That was designed to educate the public around gerrymandering and redistricting issues, and it was launched in concert with the Whitford litigation in 2015. In 2017, Citizen Action and the Fair Elections Project helped co-found, along with many, many other wonderful organizations from whom we'll hear from leaders today, the Fair Maps Coalition, which is also 501c3 and nonpartisan, and includes Republican activists, includes Democratic activists, include people who reject the two-party system and hate it, people from the far left and the far right, who believe that our democracy requires a fair election and democracy process in order to get to the place where we have, in a republic, where we get the representatives who then make the decisions on behalf of the people at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. And so the coalition has about 25 organizational members that are listed on our website at fairmapswy.com. We have about 30,000 supporters on an email list, and we are funded almost entirely by individual small donations, although we do get some grant funding occasionally from 501c3 foundations.
Thank you. It's a big group.
Yep, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Next up, we have